All right. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Scott Kearnan. I am an editor at Boston Magazine, and I'm very excited today for a wonderful conversation with Cara Smyth. Now, by way of brief introduction, Cara is a Gabelli Fellow and founder of the Responsible Business Coalition, as well as founder and chair of Fashion Makes Change, a project of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. She's also the leader of Accenture's Responsible Retail Data-Driven ESG practice. Cara, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Such a pleasure to be with you, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you. So that's just the tip of a very tall and busy iceberg in terms of what you do and all the hats you wear. I thought it would be helpful for folks, if you would, to just walk us through a little bit of your career trajectory and specifically some of the milestones that have really informed your commitment to sustainability and fashion.
Yeah, so I guess I would start by saying I was probably an unlikely sustainability warrior, if you would. I grew up in the fashion and apparel business, working for big brands like Burberry and Jill Sander and so on. And then about 9 years ago, there was a factory collapse in Bangladesh that killed 1,200 apparel industry workers. And I kind of made a very hard right into the world of nonprofit, actually. And started, as you mentioned, the research center based at Fordham, really focusing on profitability and sustainability. What does collective action look like? And that research center, what started kind of with a casual breakfast among CEOs, has now turned into home to about 50 CEOs that represent 275 brands. And together we've been working a long time on collective action. So what can we do together on net zero, on preferred fibers, on chemicals, and all of the critical issues, labor rights, and so on. And then about 2 years ago, we were trying to do a report on data-driven environmental, social, and governance and the role of technology. And I was very fortunately introduced to Jill Standish, who is the head of retail globally for Accenture. And the joke is kind of in 10 minutes, I got kidnapped into the firm, which is fantastic. And I would say so many of the companies we were working with wanted bigger help. You really need an army of help when you're thinking of all of the entangled issues that make up environmental, social, or governance and ESG. You need a lot of data, a lot of operating efficiencies, and so on. So the role in Accenture is amazing because it puts a lot of our nonprofit work almost on steroids, if you will.
Absolutely. I think it's important too to sort of step back and think about that word sustainability for a moment. We had a conversation earlier in the week where we talked a little bit about, the perception of what sustainability in fashion means to some folks and what it really means to you. Tell me a little bit about that definition for you.
Yeah, I think maybe sort of the old way of thinking about sustainability is evaporating. The idea of I run my business over here and over there's a department that is trying to eliminate negative consequences is no longer the case, particularly in fashion. I think when we talked about sustainability in fashion, people always expected I would come in a hemp dress with flowers in my hair. They were not expecting what has to happen is considering environmental, social, and governance in every single vertical, in every single company, so that we're all making better product, which allows consumers to make better decisions. So I think it's a shift towards responsible retail, a shift towards responsible business, and that's a lot different than just addressing, what is my blouse or dress made of? Much wider landscape.
Fair enough. I don't have any flowers in my hair today. I put some on my tie just, for the occasion, though. I hope that helps. I'd love to learn, too, in terms of the importance of the fashion industry in this larger conversation about sustainability. Obviously, it's important in all industries. What role do you think fashion plays in particular in terms of being a leader in sustainability?
Yeah, there's a couple of things about fashion, and I guess we could look at sort of the positive and the negatives there. We're always talking about fashion's numbers, and people hear a lot about that. So we are responsible for 20% global wastewater, close to 10% carbon emissions. We have 75% women in our supply chain, many in vulnerable areas around the world. So there's always these questions: overconsumption, overproduction, a lot to think about there. On the other side, we're actually very often the first step into poverty, with jobs in agriculture, manufacturing, even retail, and so on. And if you take those numbers and then also think about fashion's ability to drive and reflect both cultural change and behavioral change, because of what sort of style is all about. We're very much connected, obviously, to the media world, to the film world, and so on. So I think the power of fashion that is strangely unlike any other industry because we're hardwired for change is super powerful. Bad thing, we make a lot of products. The good thing is we're used to a gallop of change. And so to bring new practices into the things that we do, which are already changing all of the time anyway, I think is more simple for us in some ways than people that are always making the same thing. Creates challenges and simplicities. But I think fashion is sort of hardwired to push sustainability forward just by the nature of our business.
No, that's a really great point. And what do you see as right now some of the most critical sustainability challenges that are facing fashion?
Yeah, well, we're all coming up on COP26 and the climate conferences that will be held in Glasgow. So a lot of conversations, obviously, on carbon and climate and how do we all get net zero as quickly as we can. 2050 goals are being pulled back to 2040, and everybody's saying we should be kind of about halfway by 2030 if we feel that we can be sure we're going to make it. So I think that's one critical thing. Also very critical is the idea of educating and empowering women in our supply chain, especially as we think of business shifting. People are onshoring, they're nearshoring, automation is coming. So what does that actually mean around the world is another critical element. How do we manage everything from regenerative agriculture to be sure that we are kind of growing, grazing, and converting raw materials in the most positive, healthy way possible that we can for the planet and for the consumers that are wearing their clothes. So lots of entangled issues bubbling up. Something that I love is this idea of the next frontier, which in sustainability, I think means engaging consumers in the process. So there are kind of some gaps, I would say. Couple of the things would be, what about on-product consumer labeling? What would that look like so consumers could more easily shop their values? Almost like a calorie label. You know, I would love to know what is it or what isn't it. Consumers can then make their own choices. But I think closing those gaps and unleashing the power of citizens, I don't even want to call them consumers, to shop in the way that they want is quite important and interesting. So I think we'll start to see a lot of that very frank dialogue between brands and the people that are buying from them, which will bring, I hope, also an acceleration towards the different things that the industry is trying to achieve.
Absolutely. Sorry. So some really great things to untangle in there. And I'm going to start with what you just mentioned. I love that idea of a label that could sort of, give you that sort of information and empower consumers to make smart choices. In coming up with solutions like that, as just one example, where do you see the relationship going in terms of corporate responsibility and public policy, where we sort of need to get, some more governmental stakeholders involved in some of these processes?
Yeah, interesting. I think we are now seeing a couple of big step changes kind of coming out of COVID, which is interesting. And I would say it's kind of creating maybe a domino effect. So the EU obviously is talking a lot about regulations, the Green Deal, Build Back Better, and so on. Most fashion companies sell internationally, so there's pressure coming there. We also saw the role of investors. Everybody from Larry Fink, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, so many are asking, we'd like to have data-driven ESG progress. What does that look like? Then consumers are asking, oh, what am I actually wearing? Employees are saying, I want to be part of purpose-driven practices. So I think there's sort of an entangled approach now to what's coming. I think regulations have a lot to do with it. I would say, I believe business is also successfully moving in a positive direction in many ways. The regulatory environment forces it and accelerates it, but I think businesses in and of their own accord are also moving, which is critical. So I guess this alignment of stakeholders will support the regulatory environment, but important regardless of what that regulatory environment is, that we're all marching towards the North Star of what we know needs to be done regardless of it.
Absolutely. Well, and the pandemic has certainly impacted supply chains, among other issues, profoundly. What new challenges, or perhaps challenges that already exist but have been exacerbated by the pandemic in that light?
So I think, it's interesting because if we talk about fashion and sustainability, I could talk about a lot of key topics. We also know there's merchandise stuck all over the world. There's a higher cost to serve for fashion businesses, obviously, because so much going digital and the different situations with ports and costs and so on. So always interesting to look at what's right for sustainability, what's right for the business, how do these two operating efficiencies come together? And I think super critical here is the role of technology. So if we're looking at supply chains, we now have the benefit of AI, ML. Where should inventory be? What are customers most often buying? How do we shorten the last mile? How do we drive those operating efficiencies? And I kind of think of technology almost like the parentheses around ESG. So on the front side, if we're smarter about what are we making, where is inventory, how are supply chains running, what do logistics look like, and so on the back end, the closed parentheses is how are we capturing all of that data? So we create a system that learns, and we have the transparency that all of the stakeholder groups, consumers, investors, employees, and so on that I mentioned before, really have access to. I think everybody wants to see end to end in the supply chain. Still a little bit of a ways to go there, obviously. I mean, we're shifting ancient systems to be kind of under this digital spotlight. But fascinating to see what technology can do to make us smarter, cleaner, greener, which is all part of the path that we're on here.
Absolutely. Necessity is the mother of invention, as they say.
Exactly.
In terms of applying this lens to the work that you do at Accenture, tell me a little bit about sort of how you're moving those ESG objectives forward.
Yeah, so I think, first thing, because I'm kind of a newish bee, I would say, at Accenture. I joined about a year and a half ago. And as a self-confessed sustainability nerd, what I would say is Accenture is like, I feel like I'm a kid in a candy store. So to have the power of data and technology and all of those relationships that exist to understand how to get smarter is really critical when we're thinking about embedding into the verticals of the business. Understanding really well how do businesses actually run. It's easy to say fashion should do X, Y, and Z. You really have to have a clear understanding, for example, that 50% of fashion's impacts roundabout come in the early stages of supply chain. So what has to happen there? What are the ways that we can accelerate those things? And I think understanding the individuality in each of the verticals of a business to focus on profitability and sustainability is sort of a superpower of the firm. Also, weirdly, Accenture is, I shouldn't say weirdly maybe, but is divided into 19 different industry verticals. So if we would want to untangle something on a net zero strategy, I can go to an energy team. If we're trying to untangle something on chemicals, I have a chemicals team. If you're thinking about preferred rates of capital or green bonds, there's a finance team. So ESG is kind of or sustainability, kind of a weird thing, because this idea of it being a team sport, that it takes all different departments, all different actors, end to end in the business to start to do something differently. The myriad of experts that you need, because it's such an interconnected process, I think is something that the firm is super good at. And for me, again, as being kind of this sustainability nerd, as I said, seeing that Accenture really walks the walk, has our own science-based target, will be at gender equity with a target by 2023, net zero by 2023. Important to do it to yourself first, right, before you're trying to take other people along on the journey. And it's fantastic to work in everything beyond fashion, which is in retail, from food to hardlines to electronics to drugstores, and understand the interconnectedness of the problems and the goals everybody has made. I think is a huge accelerant as cross-sector collaborations are trying to get us all to be smarter, faster.
Absolutely. Well, as you say, you have to live your values before you can get other folks on board with them. And also it provides a sort of proof of concept. It demonstrates for folks that these tactics, these ideas can really work and be implemented.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
In terms of bringing stakeholders to the table, tell us a little bit more specifically about the mission of Fashion Makes Change and how you're doing it through that organization as well.
Yeah, so that's kind of interesting. I would say we have been trying to close gaps and convene strange bedfellows, also called stakeholders, over the years that maybe don't necessarily come together. And that started with the research center and, as I mentioned, the breakfast. Can we get a couple of CEOs around the table to say, what might we do together? And I confess it was a little easier to get the business folks together. All of our CEOs assigned company liaisons. How do we drive this through? What does that look like in the business? Then we tried to get the nonprofits together, and I confess that was a little more difficult, strangely. Everybody obviously looking for conversations with brands, same philanthropy, but there's a fantastic group of, I would consider kind of team captains in a group called the Fashion Conveners, which are focusing on key issue areas, WHO on preferred fibers like textile exchange, ZDHC on chemicals, UNFCCC with Fashion Pact and so on. So that group also meets. So we have kind of the business meeting, the nonprofits meeting, and out of these groups was born Fashion Makes Change. And that really is, once you've convened people and you've had that conversation, how do you maybe tether people to concrete actions and collective action? Like, what does that actually mean? And so Fashion Makes Change is, we call a triple impact initiative to engage consumers in the dialogue, closing that gap, to amplify and expand women's education in the supply chain, and to decarbonize the supply chain as well for fashion, based on all of those kind of fashion's bad numbers that I was mentioning before. And so that really was born on, how do we have a dialogue with consumers at point of sale? Can we invite them to round their purchase up to the nearest dollar when they're shopping, to expand upon what the industry is already doing to educate and empower women? And so that, I would say, almost sisters raising up their sisters around the world is quite interesting, because it's about 70% women that buy all of the clothes for themselves, men, for families, and so on. And it's about 70% women that make the clothes. So if every time you're shopping, you're donating and you're rounding up to the nearest dollar to amplify education, it's a hugely powerful instrument. So I would say Fashion Makes Change is sort of a practical solution that brings together nonprofits that are actually doing the on-the-ground education for women, all of the brands together. It's based and housed inside Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, which is quite important and interesting, giving us all of the credibility and the support of a philanthropic organization such as Rockefeller. So lots of different people coming together to solve the world's problems. And after a long, hard year of COVID, I would say that feels quite heartening and hopeful at the moment.
Oh, I can imagine. Well, I'm curious, in terms of bringing some of these stakeholders together, are there any partnerships or relationships that have formed as a result that maybe have surprised even you, in terms of, connecting dots that might seem sort of disparate to a lot of folks?
Yes, so I would say couple of them. I think everybody expects us to be talking to the UN, to the nonprofits, to the brands, and so on. That's kind of typical. When we came on to Fashion Makes Change, it was quite interesting, because early on, one of the brands said to us, "Oh, I run on Shopify platform, which is a merchant ecosystem. Can you try to understand how we could round up our purchases, how we as a brand could donate money also to the cause? How could we do matching or push periods or engage with our consumers at different moments?" So back to Jill Standish that I mentioned earlier at Accenture, she introduced me to the folks there at Shopify. And my question kind of was, how could we figure out roundup coding? And instead, together with Shopify and another group called Pledge, we were able to build our own Fashion Makes Change app, which allows easy integration on the Shopify platform. So there too, this idea of, once we see something is working, we launched with 50 plus brands, then to fold in somebody like Shopify, which is sort of a rocket booster, blast off, and an accelerant. I think that is what feels super exciting about, let's stop announcing what we're going to do and scale what we know works. And again, it goes back to sort of the strange bedfellows. People are coming together saying, I want to be part of the change. And what is my skill set? What can I bring to the table to do that? And so from, whether it be media outlets that are amplifying it together with us, or all of these other cast of characters, I would say, that are involved there, it's given it such a boost and a very quick liftoff. And that feels, again, super exciting after a long, hard year, I guess.
No, that's fantastic. In bringing folks together, I'm also curious, what sort of challenges or maybe opportunities are you identifying, just in terms of getting folks on board with the idea that sustainability is not just about social responsibility, but that it's also good business as well?
Yeah. I think, when we started, the idea was, what's the right thing to do? We need to check all of these boxes to show that a corporation was a good citizen.
Yeah.
Now, the fact that profitability and sustainability exist and there is a nexus between these two things is seen in a lot of places. So a lot of, like, if I think about, what are we doing at Accenture with AI retail, smarter inventory, how are we managing returns? What do we need to learn about that? Or scenario modeling the future to understand where supply chains should be, and so on. There's a lot of operating efficiencies that reduce environmental and social impacts. So that becomes the beginning of a journey of, oh, if I'm more efficient and I have less waste, kind of chase the waste, I'm running a better business. Then I think there's sort of this environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, for growth. Consumers are asking and they care. They want to be part of the conversation, part of the story. What's in my products? What am I eating? What about beauty? What's on my body? And so on. So I think there is now a lot of communication, this idea of how are we speaking to consumers about the products, also now is a necessity if you want to have a foundation for growth, particularly with all of the Gen Zers, millennials. I'm always saying I'm a 50-year-old Gen Zer. I think if the better information you have, the better you do, but consumers want to know. And then I mentioned a little bit before the investment community. It is very clear that operating margins, valuation, resilience, even during COVID, if you are managing your environmental, social, and governance in a serious way, you are more profitable. So the old idea of thinking about sustainability as a nice to have, when you think about it, forces me to operate efficiently. It forces me to look into the future to be sure I'm embedding resilience. It forces me to communicate with my customers in a new way, and it improves valuation. I think we don't have anymore this idea of like, oh gosh, this is something we need to do. It's still not easy, difficult. There's so many different subjects tangled in the E, tangled in the S, tangled in the G. So not exactly easy, but I think there is no going back. We all know that responsible business is the way of the future. I think those that may have said in the past sort of science, schmience, I'm not really sure if climate change is a thing. You look out to see California, you look out, there's more and more evidence for even the non-believers that maybe didn't want to believe the science, that we are in the red zone, as all of the recent reports are saying, and we'll hear a lot about at COP next week. But there's no going back, so you may as well embrace it. If you want to have a business that sustains in the future, somebody recently said, it better be a sustainable business.
Well, absolutely. As you say, this is important to consumers. They're thinking about it. They're asking about it. They're paying a lot more attention than they used to. I do a lot of writing and reporting about food systems, for example. And I mean, food systems have been tackling some of these issues for a very long time with a lot of success in the public sphere. I'm curious, are there frameworks that you look at from other industries that you think are valuable to sort of transpose on what you're doing in fashion?
I think, there's lots of things to learn in different places. We love tracking food, actually. It's interesting because, a lot of the food companies were talking about regenerative agriculture, whether it be, the Walmarts of the world, Pepsi, Starbucks. A lot of people are announcing regenerative agriculture goals. Yeah. Now, even in fashion, we're seeing that, which is interesting. So Kering and Gucci Group is talking about regenerative agriculture. So getting that far back to say, what do we have to do carbon sink and be sure that we are sort of replenishing what we need is quite interesting. So I think there's a strong eye on what is happening in food. If we think about ways to regulate carbon offsetting, a lot of people are looking, what about the industry alliances that are forming even in the airlines? I think finance as an instrument is always quite interesting. What about green bonds? What will that mean for insurance? The more companies are encouraged to do the right thing and achieve their goals, the less costly that will be for finance, for insurance, and so on. So like the problems are entangled, I think the solutions are entangled, and there's a lot to learn from who's doing well in different places.
Absolutely. Now, we spoke a little bit about gender equity and how this fits into the overall sustainability framework, but I want to dig into that just a little bit more. Where do you see those intersections in terms of both the challenges and the solutions around building gender equity and building a more sustainable fashion industry? Because I think there might be some people who say, well, how do those two things kind of come together in harmony?
Yeah, I think we have a longer way to go than I wish. Yeah. So I think, COVID brought a lot of interesting changes. And I think the idea of inclusion and diversity, diverse teams, whether that also has to do with gender equity, is critical as we look to the creativity and the potential for the future. If those things are not getting married into what we're doing, and we're not getting all ideas at the table to serve all communities, we're never going to maximize the innovation, the opportunities, the pathways for all people all over. So I think, a lot to do there. I wish it was faster. I think particularly in fashion, it's a worry for us during COVID, which is part of the reason why Fashion Makes Change got going. When shopping stopped, that I think a lot of people say overconsumption, overproduction, and we think about that, which is true. But when it closed, the ripple effect that we saw across supply chains and how many people in vulnerable communities were actually out of work, women in particular, is kind of frightening. So it makes us all think, what is the future of work? How do we manage just and fair transitions? How do we skill workers to be more comfortable in a digital world? Or how do we skill workers to be part of this idea of moving towards net zero or regeneration or looking for efficiencies and so on? So whatever it is that needs to be done to unleash the power of our workforce and our citizens collaborating on these solutions needs to be done. Tangled web, been a lot to do there.
Fair enough. Well, in terms of untangling that web, what responsibility do you place on consumers to help move the needle and get that buy-in to be part of this change?
So I think there's a few things, and I guess I'm a consumer myself, right? So I can always think about it through my own lens. I think there's a couple of things to say. One is dollars are like votes, right? So spend where you think the company is doing the right thing. I think consumers have the obligation and responsibility to get smart. So it's easy to say, oh, that should be a regulatory body, the brand should take care of it, oh, little me, what can I do? But if everybody does little me, what can I do? We don't get anywhere. So the idea of saying what companies are doing the right thing, what matters to me when I'm shopping, I think is one thing that is critically important, to be aware of the issues and then behave accordingly. You can even do it in your own home. How much trash am I throwing away? I would say it's a bit provocative, but who drank from a plastic water bottle today? How many people are really wearing organic cotton? How many are noticing if their products are recyclable or not? So, if we all ask ourselves, can I do a little better? There's not a one that's going to say, I can't. So I would say, get smart about the issues and shop at the ones you think you deserve. Pay attention to what you're doing. And the last thing I would say is use your voice. Every single company is watching their social media very clearly. The signals come. How many times did that get passed? Everybody's social scraping, everybody's personalizing. If a customer start to say, I want more information, I want to be educated, please feed us that information. And I'm expecting you as a company to get on a path towards progress on X, Y, and Z issues. You can be sure that the brands will get on the path that their customers are demanding. So get smart, pay attention to what you're doing individually, and use your voice, I would say, would be the three.
Absolutely. And all that goes for the media as well. We also have a role to play in this and making sure that we're getting the information out there and being responsible in how we present it.
Totally. Yeah, listen, the media is sort of like the fashion industry. You drive and influence and shape behavioral change and shape cultural change. So you are sort of the conduit of the messages in a lot of ways. And so the more that you can educate, people make better decisions when they know more, like we all do. I mean, everybody is Googling around the world. We have better information, you make a better decision. And that's a huge opportunity for the media to be sure that you continue to push out what needs to be confronted and maybe also good news. Tell the good news stories of look at the progress that's being made, look at the paths that people are on. So yes, we all have a lot of opportunities from our corner of the world to do it together.
Cheers to that. And thank you so much for being such a leading messenger and happy warrior in this fight for sustainability and gender equity.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure being with you, and thanks a million for having me.
Thank you. Great talking to you.
You too. Bye-bye now. Thanks.